Welcome to Healing Voices Project, where we share stories of addiction, grief, recovery, and courage. And also from people who work every day in the field of substance abuse who discuss their experiences and advice. I'm Mike Torville, your host. Thank you all for joining us. Glad to be back here, everybody, at Healing Voices Project. We're glad to have you listening, and also glad to have our next guest here, Dr. Lina Racicot, who's been a previous guest, and so thanks for coming back. Appreciate you taking time out to be here. Dr. Lina Racicot is the Director of Graduate Psychology at AIC, and Lina, you've been doing that for how many years now?
Oh, for about 14 years.
14 years.
So quite a long time. However, I want to say thank you for having me first.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to be here because I think it's so important to have open conversations around the issues of substance use disorder.
Yeah, you're right. Open conversations and creating awareness. I think that's what it's all about, informing people, getting people accurate information. And besides being the Director of Graduate Psychology at American International College, better known as AIC,
Yes.
You're also an author of the book called Living with the Little Devil Man, about your experience with your son, who went through years of heroin addiction, and the story. And I think that, and we were talking about that earlier, and of course I read it. I more than read it, because I actually, it was so compelling, I included it in my book, Voices from the Fallen, because Sterling's story is very compelling. He's a person you get attached to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
My students tell me they fall in love with him.
Yeah.
But it's important that to recognize he was a real person who lived the horror of opioid addiction.
And so besides your professional work, you've experienced this firsthand in your home.
Yes.
For years, and you watched how this progressed, so you can speak from that point of view as well.
Right, and I think it's also very important to recognize there's times where the addiction to heroin wasn't there, and that he was this absolutely wonderful, fun, energetic person to be around. He lived in my home for 10 years, and yes, I adopted him as my son, and he did have a history of childhood trauma. That's very important to recognize that is, to me, the greatest risk to later intravenous drug use. And we know that through the CDC's research as well, in particular through Folletti in 1997, who did a very large study of 11,000 individuals. And they found certain types of childhood trauma led to greatest risk of intravenous drug use. So I think, but we also have to recognize the way our society is today, that anyone could become addicted because the harsher drugs are accessible, even to our younger
accessible and cheaper
folks.
too.
Right. Even our youth, and we have to protect them. And so, but we look at Sterling and we fall in love with him because he suffered so much, and really just recognizing his greatness beyond his addiction that took him down.
And Sterling's story, I think, what got to me most is very relatable to anyone's child, friend.
Yes.
And he had a lot of friends, family members, you as his mom at home, and no matter what you've tried to do, and even the book describes this, all the different courses of action, and how much you get involved and how much you pulled away, no matter what you thought was right, in the end
it wasn't enough.
It wasn't enough. Yeah.
It wasn't enough, and there was many times where I was called the enabler. And that is true. However, I tried everything and anything from, picking him up from the hospital when he overdosed, bringing him to crisis, finding him a safe place to be, and I thought towards the end that I had found the place that would help him, but that is the place he ended up overdosing and passing.
You mentioned enabling, and I think that's so common. We all do it, and then we have a problem. Oh, if I'm trying to be the parent, and you don't think of it as enabling at the time, you think of it as just trying to help. And looking back, I'm sure you could second guess yourself and say, I should have made different decisions.
Sometimes I felt that
Yeah.
way, and other times I felt like I should have done even more. You know.
So how
So
do you
it's
reconcile
hard.
that? Yeah, that's
Right,
hard. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do want to mention an online resource for families going through this called Allies in Recovery.
Allies in Recovery.
Allies in Recovery. Yeah, Allies.
Alliesinrecovery.com. Is it a website?
I can't remember if it's .com or .org.
People
it is a
can
website.
Google it. Allies
Yes.
in Recovery. Okay.
Yes, and they actually have something called the CRAFT model, CRAFT, which is a scientifically tested model to be very effective in helping your family members with addiction. And it gives you lots of resources and stories that can help you understand when to pull back. I wish I had that resource at the time, you know.
It's so hard to pull back because you
Right.
find if I pull back and leave this person alone, I can pretty much count on
Right.
something going wrong, and often tragically. And nobody wants to face that, obviously.
Right.
And so you think, well, I'd rather try to help out, but often that becomes counterproductive. You get the wrong results because the person just perpetuates the behavior. There's no way to know.
That is true no matter what.
Yeah.
However, one of the things that Allies in Recovery teaches us is about harm reduction. And there's some people who are advocates of harm reduction and some who aren't. But looking back, I think if I had used more harm reduction with Sterling, we may have seen a better outcome rather than trying to. We all rush to a child who's sick, right? And we want to heal that child. And that's what I wanted to do. That's it.
It's instinctive.
I wanted that antibiotic or whatever that would heal
Right.
Sterling. But
Yeah.
that's not the way addiction works. You know, addiction is physiological, psychological, emotional. And there are times where I got frustrated, and I'm sure many family members felt this way. Why can't you just stop? I don't understand. Just stop. You know, look at all the people you're hurting.
You're a pretty smart, educated woman.
Thank you.
I noticed. But why I mention that is because with all your education, with your training, with the field of psychology, okay, you still had a difficult time figuring this out.
That's absolutely true.
For most of us, you know, people who don't have the background you have, how in the world are we supposed to expect to handle this correctly?
Right. So despite my knowledge, I still had those moments when I said, why can't you just stop? Where I already knew that his body was sending the messages, you have to have this drug. You can't live without it. You know, between his physiological self and how his brain worked and all the messages he received was that he was not going to be okay without it. Not to mention the withdrawal symptoms, you know. And there's many highly educated individuals dealing with a loved one with addiction. I got a phone call not too long after this person left my place of work, and that person said to me, "Can you help me? My daughter is addicted to pills, opioids." And this person was at a higher level than I was as far as career paths.
Okay, yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah.
And that person also understood the physiological aspects of addiction, but still, how do you help your loved one? It's still a question.
How do you help your loved one when your instinct is to care for them, nurture them, enable them? Because this, and I don't want to say separate yourself, but pull back and observe and say, okay, what would I do if this was someone else? You know, without the emotional tie in there. So yeah, I don't know. There isn't an answer, but I guess the answer is the more you learn, the more awareness you have, the more you can at least try to apply what you've learned and try that. And again, I relate to our family because anybody can say, well, because that's the first thing you do is you relate to, oh yeah, my family member was going through this, and how did I react? What did I do? Or what are we going to do now? What do I do next? And as a family, we were going through a lot, trying to figure out what to do. And we, in hindsight, we made bad decisions. Or
Right.
what's an interesting little aspect is collectively as a family, in the end, we were trying to coordinate our efforts. But for example, somebody else in my family might say, "Oh, I'm going to do this," or "I'm going to lend money to help out," and the other person says, "Oh, don't you dare do that. That's the wrong thing to do." Then you have these conflicting messages, and of course that person hears different things from one family member or another because it's not a coordinated effort, and so there's some confusion there. And of course, sometimes the family dynamics, one family member is mad at the other one for providing the tough love and saying no, let him or her go, or no, I want to help, and that becomes disruptive to say the least, but confusing. And of course that person who's going through the addiction will zero in on the person who's more likely to enable.
Absolutely.
And
Right.
and that creates a very tough family dynamics.
It does, and that's
Yeah.
where something like the craft model would help. Just a very simple example of the craft model. When do you allow your loved one with addiction to borrow the car? Well, you do if that person is going to work, back and forth to work only, until you then see greater signs of sobriety. But in the meantime, you don't just, give out that car,
Yeah.
even though you want to help that person. And it's similar with money. When do you give the money? Do you hand money over? Do you purchase them food that they need or something like that? And so if you stop and think about it, you'll make your best decision. However, we all have to forgive ourselves.
Yeah.
We are all human beings and all prone to error. And we have to look back and say, I was trying the best I could, and I need to forgive myself.
And I guess one idea that I'm sure comes up if a family, maybe early on as possible, to avoid this, and maybe you don't recognize it until after something happens, is to say, let's get together and coordinate our efforts here, and what is our response going to be? What do we agree on? Because then you're not going to have that other conflict and mixed messages, and if you have some sort of a collective effort there, then it's going to hopefully send that person a more consistent message.
That's a
Yeah.
great idea, because
Yeah.
someone who's desperate to get money for the drug that they need, they think they need, is going to give different messages to each person and make it even more confusing.
Yes.
So I think that's a really great idea, Mike.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
if a family could say, what do we do, not what do I do. So there's a husband saying, well, I'm going to give him money because he needs to do whatever, and then the mom is mad at the husband for doing. Well, let's determine that as much or as early on as possible.
Well, true,
Yeah.
and also maybe
Yeah.
mom gave money and dad didn't know, and now dad gave money for the same purpose. All right?
That's right. I used to do that as
Yeah,
a teenager.
right. There we go.
Yeah.
So people do become manipulative
Yeah.
when they are under the spell of addiction.
Yeah.
It changes the way their brain works,
Yeah.
and it's something real. It's a disease,
Mm-hmm.
So we have to recognize that their brains are not working the way they used to work.
And you think of things. This just popped into my head because I didn't see. There's an interview, Diane Sawyer and Matthew Perry, and I didn't see it yet, but I saw a little previews of it. And one of the things I read that Matthew Perry would do is, and how clever is this? Who would think of this? Normally, he would go to open houses on a Sunday afternoon, walk through the house, find his way into the bathroom, shut the door, pretend he's using the bathroom, and go through the medicine cabinet and take out the pills that he desired, put it back, and then leave. Thanks for the tour. Find the next house, and that an afternoon's work gave him a supply.
Very creative.
Who would think of that?
A desperate person.
Yes.
Right.
Right. And there's all kinds of other things. That's just one example that popped into my head.
Right.
But these are things you go, wow, yeah. But somehow there's a way for people to keep that going. Now, you've seen this besides your own personal experience with the work you do. Actually, let's talk about that. What you do at AIC as a director of graduate psychology with mental illness and all these related trauma and things. How do you spend your typical day at AIC?
So in the classroom, let's
Yeah.
talk about that. That's
Yeah.
where we train our students to go out and become mental health counselors.
Okay.
or work with individuals who are in the criminal justice system. And so I have forensic psychology in which they work with that population, the incarcerated, and those coming out of incarceration and re-entry into the community. It's important that we also support them to have the resources they need to be healthy and not go directly back to whatever drove them into the jail system.
Okay.
And so that's one program I have. And then the mental health counseling program is really specific in itself because that's a licensure track program. The state of Massachusetts realizes our counselors need to be licensed. They realized that a long time ago. So those individuals have to be trained to deal with trauma, substance use disorder, family therapy. I mean, I could go on and on. So we have a number of classes, 60 full credits for that program, so that when our students leave AIC, they're ready. And when they go out there, they often see individuals with substance use disorder. And that's because it's embedded across our society. And if that person in front of them doesn't have SUD, one of their loved ones may. So we have to make sure they're prepared. That type of counseling is a little different, or a lot different, depending on the situation, than working with someone without that disorder.
Yeah, and you talked about trauma, other mental illnesses too, and how the impact of that. Yeah.
The very important piece that I have embedded in my coursework is Sterling. Sterling is so important. His life goes on, let me tell you. The students, the first course they take is human development, and they need to understand what type of things affect human development across the lifespan. And so understanding Sterling's path of childhood trauma and childhood adverse experiences and how it changed his development and who he became is essential for my students to realize who that person is in front of them that they're counseling and how they have to understand what affected their development. So it all starts in childhood, early childhood.
And if it starts in early childhood, you have years and years and years of behavior or issues and things to unravel there, which aren't going to be solved in a week.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to build that trust before you can even start talking about the surface problems, before you get into those layers. But I just want to repeat that some individuals have not had childhood trauma, but as they develop through life, they were exposed to certain drugs, partying maybe, perhaps they had, a minor operation and were given a prescription and then, became addicted that way. There's so many paths to drug addiction and alcohol addiction that we have to be wary of all those paths, but also just absolutely be knowledgeable about childhood trauma.
Yes, and that certainly is a big factor. And I think sometimes whether it's alcohol or drugs, and sometimes it doesn't stem from mental illness or trauma. It just simply stems from peer pressure.
Yes.
My friends are, drinking, so I'm going to drink too. It was somebody say, "Hey, let's take this," and they called me a wimp if I didn't do it, and so I just said, "Well, what the heck?" And the next thing you know, as time goes, a person becomes addicted, and it simply is a result of the activities or the peer pressure. It sucks them in.
Well, what's interesting with Sterling is that in his adolescence, rather than acknowledge that he had a mental health issue, his friends would have rather acknowledged that he was drunk when he had hallucinations. So that's where he started drinking. So alcohol was also a problem for him. And that opened the door for other substances.
Yeah.
But he did have a mental illness in which was not addressed. So we have that comorbidity as well that can be an issue.
Yeah.
So both mental illness and substance use disorder.
Right.
So even more layers to unravel. But there is hope. I want to make sure people understand that the message is there is hope.
And I think the hope, through the treatment, there's hope. But before the treatment, it has to be recognized.
Yes.
And take some initiative action. Some initiative towards action and say, okay, well, what do we do? Instead of ignoring it. We talked about this previously. Is a family member might say, well, gee, I don't know, something's not right. And it may be, oh, this person, that's just how they are. But it doesn't get nobody takes any action with it because it just goes along, because families don't know what to do. We talked about how people aren't aware what to do and they don't recognize it, but the recognition is the first thing.
It is harder when it's right in front of you as well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, to recognize something that didn't happen overnight.
Yeah.
You know, it was a slow process.
Right.
And the slow change is harder to recognize than, say, seeing a person after 10 years and saying, ooh, what's going on there?
Mm-hmm.
You know, because then you see the sudden change from 10 years ago.
It's like not seeing my grandson, right? He's the youngest one. He's 3. If I don't see him for a month, he's grown. And I said to my daughter-in-law, I said, "What happened? He's grown." She goes, "Oh, really? I hadn't."
That's a good analogy.
It because you see the difference over
right.
but when you see something every day, you don't notice.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, and then once you do it, it's sometimes it's other people that say, "Hey, what's wrong? What's happening?"
Right.
Now you talked about alcoholism, and I know you wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Yes. Alcohol use disorder.
Especially during the past few years.
Right.
Yeah,
Through the pandemic, we've seen so many people turn to alcohol for coping, whether it was the stress of the pandemic or loneliness, boredom, or being
isolation.
Being in the household with someone who was already somewhat abusive, or it was full-blown domestic violence, and now they're in the home, night and day with that person, and so the coping skills, or even the codependency, maybe both of them were drinking, and so in order to cope and get through the day and the night, I think that in the near future, we're going to see that increase in numbers, but right now we don't have the numbers because we're coming out of that time period.
Yeah.
But also, I also think that psychological abuse increased because people were together all the time, and
it just takes so much of that.
If there was a stronger personality, there would be some, the person with, the fear of that person would, typically go to coping with alcohol if there was nothing else. The resources weren't there. The mental health services weren't there like they used to be. There was telehealth, but many people told me I didn't get much out of telehealth. Well, some people liked it. It's hard to say. We don't have the statistics around that yet either about how effective was telehealth.
Right. And if I recall, there was a lot of businesses closed during the pandemic, but the liquor stores weren't.
They were considered essential.
Essential.
Right.
Now, okay, you look at that a couple different ways. Why were they considered essential?
It was really around the mental health piece and the domestic violence, and thinking also
that would ease the problem.
That, but also the physical health around somebody who is an alcoholic and suddenly stops or can't go to the liquor store and get the alcohol. They would go into withdrawal, and some people have died through withdrawals from alcohol. It is an absolute possibility. Right? So I think there's more than one reason around that.
Yeah.
But most of us would say, how is that essential?
Right, but when you just described it, it makes sense. But also, too, on one hand, it certainly may have helped, prevented that from happening, but on the other hand, it may have perpetuated the problem by, I got nothing else to do, so I'm going to drink.
So once you're drinking all day for 2 years, or even just the 1 year, alcohol now controls your system. I had someone recently say to me, who recently went through detox, that she was taught that she does not abuse alcohol. Alcohol is now abusing her. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. That's an interesting way to look at it.
I've never heard that before.
Neither did I. I'm not sure I want to bring that in the classroom, but not that it's funny, but
alcohol's fault. Yeah,
right. We have to take accountability, and you said that's the first thing to acknowledge. Yes, I am an alcoholic, and we've known that for years. But to understand, though, that the body now feels it absolutely needs that alcohol, and that person is not thinking the same way that they used to think, and I have seen that personally. Change in personality, change in decision making, etc.
And a change too when you can't. And we just said alcohol was available, but when you can't get something, it makes you want it more.
That's also true.
Yeah.
Right.
It's just
that's human nature.
weird little phenomenon.
Right.
If you can't, if you tell me I can, well, it's like surgery, right? When you have surgery, so don't drink or eat before, after midnight. When I wake up, that's all I want is I'm hungrier just because I can't have it.
You think, how am I going to make it through?
Right,
I need to eat.
Right. And then, but there's a lot of mornings if I don't think about it, I find, gee, I didn't eat anything this morning because I didn't think about it. When you're forced to think about it, anyway.
Good point.
It's just one of those things, but that does happen. But yeah, I think when you said in the data hasn't filled in yet in terms of what the effect was, I think we all can sort of surmise what's happened here, but you haven't had the statistics yet come back from what the full effect is.
Right, because we need people first to come out and say, I have this problem with alcohol now.
Yeah.
I'm seeking help.
I didn't have a problem before,
right?
But through all these events, the disruption, and the other thing is the economy and the difficulties people are having with that. They lost their job, their hours have been reduced, things like this, and health. Maybe there's other things that have occurred during the pandemic, and there are many of them, but any number of those reasons could drive people to drink or to drugs.
Absolutely.
And, the isolation too, as you said, that's a big one.
Well, we did still see increases in overdoses.
Yes.
Okay, and although I read something on CDC recently that said the increases weren't as high in the past years when you compare 2020 to 21, however, the increase is still there. But, again, we were so busy dealing with this pandemic. How many of those deaths that were counted for COVID yet had an overdose?
Yeah. Well, that's a good point.
I don't know.
And
we won't know.
We won't know because I know there was all kinds of statistical inaccuracies there that, for example, if somebody had a heart attack and they died of a heart attack, clearly the death was caused by the heart attack. And after when they did the test, they said, oh, this person also had COVID. Well, that was a COVID death. They were in an accident and they found they had, that was a COVID death. Well, no, it was an accident. It was a heart attack. But the COVID numbers were built up, and it may be true if somebody had an overdose and died.
I did hear that in this local area because there was some concern about funding being reduced towards helping individuals with addiction. That early on in the epidemic or pandemic of COVID, there were individuals who passed because of overdose, but they counted as COVID.
It's COVID.
Now, this was a small, group of people telling me this.
Right.
And I don't know how often it happened, and we will never know.
Right.
However, we can't deny the fact that overdose deaths do still continue to increase, and that it's still an epidemic here in the United States.
And the epidemic, because of that, may have skewed
the pandemic may have skewed the numbers.
Skewed the numbers a little bit.
Right.
But in going forward now, and I think the thing that scares me a lot, and it scares me for like it would anyone. I have 4 grandchildren. A few of them are teenagers, and it's more accessible. They're in school, and
right.
What friends are they hanging around with? Who's their boyfriend, girlfriend? Are they okay? You have to have a little more scrutiny than you did before. But with the access, and what scares me is the fentanyl that comes in, disguised as anything. It's disguised as oxy, disguised as other pills, or even candy, and you see what's happening here.
Oh, yeah. Not too long ago, a couple young students in the area smoked marijuana before school, not knowing it was laced with fentanyl, and they had overdosed. Luckily, they were brought back and, saved. So we do have to worry about that. I think we always have to worry about what was in, what is in the drugs that our youth are buying on the street. We don't know.
Something 40-something years ago, I think it was 1980, thereabouts. It was a long time ago.
Yeah.
But I was younger. Anyway, there was...
So was I.
Yeah. How old was I? But I think I was 19 or whatever. But I do remember an occasion that scared me, too, and I don't think I've taken a recreational pill ever since then. But back then, talk about peer pressure, friends of ours were at the Cape, and hey, one of our friends said, hey, we got this mescaline. Well, mescaline, I'm naively going, well, what does that do? Oh, it makes you laugh. It's hysterical. Mescaline is harmless. It's harmless. And so, sure, okay. So I naively took the pills, and an hour later, I was spinning, I was hallucinating, and I wasn't laughing anymore like they said it would.
No laughing there.
Oh, it was awful. I wanted to kill myself because I was seeing things and I couldn't take it anymore. I got lost on the beach and panicked because I didn't know if my friends were left or right, and I was running into the fog. It was bizarre. Oh. And it went on and on and on for hours. And it wouldn't go away. It would come and go. And then when this stuff finally got out of my system, and the next day I remember being wiped out mentally and going, what the hell was that? And why in the world would anybody want to take that on purpose? And it was awful. And anyway, what my friends later said, yeah, it wasn't mescaline, it was acid.
By the way.
It was, well, why'd you say it was something else when it was acid? And I said, holy crap. Anyway, I've never touched anything like that. It was scary as hell. Right. And the point is, anybody can say, yeah, take this little pill. It's just oxy, it's this, it's that. And it's not.
And there's so many choices today.
Or let's, like you say, smoke a joint and it was laced with fentanyl. And they think it's one thing and yet it's another.
It's another.
Now I was lucky that's all it was, but it was an experience enough to say, well, that was scary, But how easy can that happen now?
Obviously very easily since it happened recently. And I'm sure across our country it's happened today. So we have to, be wary of that as well.
Yeah, and it's another subject about how this is all coming in. But nonetheless, that has to be stopped. But it's here, and how you educate people, your kids, on what to look for. And you can say, no, this is safe. It's my friend. He gave me a joint. No.
Right.
It doesn't work.
And that's why the Sheriff's Department goes into schools, and the DA with the Sheriff's Department teaching that just once.
Yes.
That's all it takes is just once.
Yep.
And you have to be very careful what your friends are offering you.
Yeah.
And if we can, get our children to walk away. But as teenagers, we all liked to experiment.
Oh, right.
We think we're invincible.
That's right.
So we have to remember that is a stage of life. But, teaching beforehand can help. Absolutely.
And I think when people do see in the community where the friends or relatives that have passed away, that's a reality people should pay attention to. But again, it's more easily said when a parent hopefully can intervene early on. And we talked about, the earlier you recognize this, to take some action. And often you say, well, I don't want to get my son or daughter mad by accusing them. But you know what? I know that's a tough thing as a parent, but it certainly is better than finding a death occurred and later on wishing that you had done something. And they're mad at you. That's temporary.
That's very true.
Yeah.
I think something else is coming out of this conversation for me
Yeah.
is the fact that we as parents have to open our minds to counseling for our youth as well. And we think that, well, they're just teenagers or they'll be fine, but perhaps they want to fit in and don't feel they fit in.
Yeah.
And that's where counseling goes beyond mental health and mental illness, I should say.
Yeah.
And actually think about well-being when we think about mental health. Okay? So preventative measures are also part of that. And we need to recognize that and recognize our youth sometimes need other resources behind hearing our voices, perhaps hearing the voice of a trained counselor.
Yeah. And to state the obvious here, because it comes up all the time, no one's immune to this. It doesn't matter what age, race, financial status you have. It is affecting everybody, more so than it did before. And so there's sometimes an attitude, we're fine, we're not part of that crowd. But that doesn't apply anymore.
It does not apply, and it just takes longer for that realization to hit. And unfortunately, sometimes it's too late.
Yeah.
So that's why we need to wake up. This is true, this is real, and it's in our society, across our society.
Yeah. Well, I know we could go on
Mm-hmm.
talking a lot about, well, and I want to mention the book again too, because I love talking with you about the book, because there's so much that we relate to in terms of your book,
Yes.
Living with the Little Devil Man, about Sterling. And of course, my book, which has 8 different stories, and Sterling is one of the stories that I just excerpts. It's a shorter version, but I thought that story was so compelling it was worth including.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sterling can teach us so much.
Right. Yeah.
Even if you didn't have his experience,
Mm-hmm.
everyone had little pieces of his experience.
Yeah.
And he is now the teacher.
Yep.
And so many of my students have told me that because of Sterling, they recognize something in their clients.
Yes, and as I said earlier, he's very relatable, and I think
is.
that's the point, to get people to say, "Hey, I recognize this," and yeah, I see the same signs, same behavior. Maybe I'll not let this go this far.
It's important to
Yeah.
recognize that he's a real person.
Yeah.
That it was not a made-up story. That once again, this happened to an individual who, in many ways, we would not expect it to.
Right. And that's so common. People say, "I didn't expect this."
Right.
That's the case with most
yes,
people.
He
Yeah.
was a strong,
Yeah.
vibrant male who had a career out of high school.
Yep.
But there was something stronger than that.
Well,
That's embedded in his life.
yeah, and that's very common. And I think what you're doing with your courses, hopefully you're getting the message out to the right people and preparing them for a career in this field. But I also want to mention that before we go, Allies in Recovery.
Yes.
Again, because I think that was worth repeating. And you mentioned in Allies in Recovery, and if you Google Allies in Recovery, you'll find Craft. Right?
Yes.
And that's...
The founder
Yeah.
is actually from the Northampton area.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes, she and I have met a number of times
Okay.
before the pandemic. Everything happened
Yeah,
before the
yeah.
We're just getting back,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And she did this because of the need in the area.
Okay.
She also works with the Sheriff's Department.
Oh,
And
okay.
So again, everything we talked about here is not only real to our country here in the United States, but real to our area, right here.
Oh,
this
yes.
intimate area of Western Massachusetts, where we have our own specific issues. Beyond anywhere else. Because if you lived here, you know that. So realize that there are people who are trying to help, and that we really want to see a change.
Yeah, and I noticed too, I can hardly find a family that's not affected directly, that doesn't have a friend, a child, a relative, because in getting more involved with this, I was astounded how many people this affected. So I think this is why just reaching out, creating awareness, and getting people to say, "Hey, you know what? I'm not immune to this. This could happen," and finding relatable stories that people say, "Yeah, maybe I ought to pay more attention to this."
I think you
Yeah.
bring a good point that
Yeah.
we talk about the trauma of the individual who has the substance use disorder, but there's also trauma of the loved ones around that person,
That's huge.
friends,
Huge.
and even
Yeah.
just peers
Mhm.
who have seen the loss of their peers in high school.
Yeah.
And I think there's also one more thing to mention around trauma, that even if an individual did not have that childhood trauma but found themselves stuck in substance use disorder, whether it be drugs, alcohol, whatever their drug of choice is,
Yeah.
they do have trauma now. Having that disorder and living that life
They didn't,
is
but
traumatic.
they do now.
Right,
Yes.
it is traumatic living that life.
Yeah.
And so as clinicians that I train, I also talk about addressing that trauma. Because people do have, despite the fact that their brains are working different than they used to, and their personalities may seem completely different, they still have guilt about what they've done.
That's
And
common.
this remorse,
Yeah.
and that can stop them from finding the help they need, because they could be in what we call learned helplessness. Why bother? I become this terrible person. I want to say that is not true. Do not feel that way. You are a person of value. You can find help, and there is hope. There are many people who found recovery, and we need to share those stories as well.
And I think it's important just reaching out, making a call, calling someone to say, I need to talk about this, rather than keeping it inside. Because maybe just talking through that can make somebody say, okay.
That's true. And if the first time doesn't work, try again.
Try again. Well,
Try again.
Well, you've shared a lot of great information,
Well, thank you.
and we've got to wrap up here. But thanks again for
You're
coming.
very welcome.
So check out Allies in Recovery, and thank you to Dr. Lina Racicot. And remember to check out her book, Living with the Little Devil Man. It's on Amazon. And also join us at healingvoicesproject.com, and you'll not only see the interview here, but others. And, check out our website. And I'm glad to have you. Thanks, everybody, for listening. And thanks again for coming.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, everyone, and stay well.
See you soon. All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.